Just as much as I wouldn't want my name to be pronounced incorrectly in other countries, I guess it might be most polite to say their names the way that they're pronounced. Jonah, Yonah, Yeshua, Yehovah. It looks like there are two separate times in Matthew when he's accused of using the power of the devil to cast out demons. Matthew 9, verse 34, but the Pharisees said he cast out devils through the prince of the devils. That might just be a mention, an anecdotal mention, because it goes in more detail in Matthew 12. And all the people were amazed and said, is not this the son of David? And when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow does not cast out devils, but by Beelzebub, the prince of the devils. And Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. Okay, so this is going to be the main time that the Pharisees mention it, because Jesus responds. The time before, when they mention it, it's just going to be an extra. They're just mad, but they didn't bring it up. They may have said it amongst the people, but they probably didn't accuse Jesus directly. But there are other events that have to come before this, before he ordained the 12, because they're written in Matthew. Even though Matthew might be out of order, if they're not mentioned in the others, there might be a problem, but I'll at least take a look at it now. Okay, the ruler has a daughter who is dead, and asks Jesus to raise her, and he goes, and then the woman with the issue of blood touches him. That's here in Matthew 9, before he ordains the 12. Let me see if it's in any other location in the other Gospels. I'm ending in Mark 5:20 is where I ended. This story comes way later in Mark. After he ordains the 12, after he is accused of healing, after the parable, after the calming of the storm, after the demons are sent into the swine, he goes into the Decapolis, and Jairus, the ruler, fell at his feet, asked him to heal his daughter, who was at the point of death, and the woman with the issue of blood comes up. So the question is, what is the actual order? Is it after the Gadarene demoniac, as in Mark, or is it before, as in Matthew? Well, the real question is then, what does Luke say? Luke, I end in 8:39. Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, fell down at Jesus' feet, besought him, and she is dying, not dead yet, but dying. Then the woman with the issue of the blood touches him. She is healed. He sends out the 12, and then the feeding of the 5,000. Let me go back to Matthew and see again how this works. Matthew 9. The man is lowered from the roof, calls Matthew. They have the meal, the question of fasting, and then the ruler, Jairus. It's not mentioned here what his name was in Matthew, but he's definitely a ruler. The woman is healed. He heals the daughter. He does another exorcism. The Pharisees have their first accusation, chapter 9, of him using the prince of the devils. Oh, okay, this is not an ordination in chapter 10. He's not ordaining them. He's mentioning who they are. He gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all manner of sickness and diseases. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. Later on, he then says, these 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, go into the way of the Gentiles, into the way of the Samaritans. So this is him sending them out. This is not his first ordination of them. Okay, so it's not quite out of order. That helps. And then John the Baptist is offended, and then they go through the corn. Although going through the corn was before the ordination in Mark and in Luke. And the withered hand comes later in Matthew. Oh, man. This is annoying. Okay, I don't know if I'm being lazy, but I'm going to check with how Michael Rood does it. So the Sermon on the Mount, that's what I have. Then the leper is healed. They lower the man from the roof. Yeah, that's what I have. Levi, Matthew is invited. Yep, that's what I have. They're plucking the ears of corn. Question about fasting comes up. Well, yeah, that's after he's invited. Yeah, okay, the question of fasting, he doesn't mention that as an event. I'm just mentioning it as a bullet point. Then the plucking of the ears of corn when they're eating on the Sabbath. Then the healing of the man with the withered hand. Then I have the ordaining of the 12. Good, that's what he has too. So up until now, we are in total agreement. Then the Sermon on the Plain. Yeah, okay, so I would go the Sermon on the Plain, the healing of the centurion's servant in Capernaum, raising of the widow from death, John the Baptist is offended, Jesus' first anointing in the Pharisees, and then he's accused of being possessed by Beelzebub. So let's see if that's what he does. The Sermon on the Plain, yes. Heals centurion's servant, yes. Raises a widow's son from death, yes. John the Baptist is offended, yes. Jesus' first anointing. And then I would go into, he's accused of using the power of Satan. His family comes to get him. That's in Mark, which I think I might have just skipped over. Yeah, okay, I guess I skipped over that. But he's accused of using the power of Beelzebub, so we're still in agreement. He gives a speech. Does it win? Okay, the parable of the sower is the next thing that I have. Parable of the sower, yep. Then what I have next is the calming of the storm, and then the demons are sent into the swine. They went to Capernaum again. The kingdom of heaven is a man. Okay, he puts a whole bunch of other parables of the kingdom of heaven, which I don't have. And then he sent the multitude away. They ask him about the parable of the tares of the field, then the calming of the storm, and sends the demons into the swine. So there are passages after the parable of the sower. He uses the passage from the parable of the sower in Matthew, which is all the way in chapter 13, and Mark 4. He goes along with the story in the order of Mark and Luke, and he grabs that story as it's recorded later on in Matthew 13. So that's what I'll have to include as well. There's a small portion in Matthew that he adds before Matthew 13, following along with the parable of the sower. And that's when he's still speaking to the Pharisees. They ask him for a sign. He says, no sign will be given but the sign of Jonah, 3 days and nights in the belly of the fish. So the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That's Matthew 12, 38 through 45. So after he's accused of being possessed by Beelzebub, before the parable of the sower, he adds a bunch of stuff in Matthew, because that does come before the parable of the sower in Matthew, even though it's not recorded in Mark and Luke, which is this conversation with the Pharisees. So I'll have that. But first, all of this stuff that we agree on after he ordains the 12, the Sermon on the Plain does come next. Healing centurion's servant. John the Baptist is offended. Jesus' first anointing in the house of Simon the Pharisee. Then he's accused of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of demons. And then this section, as he has it, the sign of the prophet Jonah is given, or Yonah as he has it written. You know, I had a big issue with this J thing because they didn't actually pronounce the J when Yeshua was actually walking the earth. They called him Yeshua. They did not use the J sound, but we in America use the letter J, and we pronounce it Jesus, Jonah. But just as much as I wouldn't want my name to be pronounced incorrectly in other countries, I guess it might be most polite to say their names the way that they're pronounced. Jonah, Yonah, Yeshua, Yehovah. I may go back and forth. I hope it doesn't upset anyone, and I hope you know enough to know who I'm talking about. If I say Yeshua, that's Jesus, right? Okay, good. That's how his name was actually pronounced when he was walking the earth. Yeshua. Don't take offense. He uses all the original pronunciations, even like Elizabeth. That's not actually how you would have pronounced her name. Elisheva is how I read it. I've never heard of that before, but that's how it's written in here, because he's trying to keep all the names pronounced the same. So if I go back and forth, whatever. I'll throw in here Yeshua. This is going to upset some people. I'll still say Jonah, because that is not a very popular name, and I want to make sure everyone knows who I'm talking about. Jonah. Yeshua gives the sign of the prophet Jonah. And then the parable of the sower and the seed on the good soil. Actually, before that, I should put in here those other two things I forgot about. Yeshua's family comes to speak with him because they think he's crazy. Jesus' family did not even believe him. Mary may have. Miriam, that was her name. Her name was actually Miriam, just like Moses' sister. And Mary is like a translation. That's a good one. She may have believed that he was the Messiah because she got that dream when he was first conceived. But his brothers, I don't think it was mentioned that he has sisters, was it? Yeshua's mother and his brothers. No, not his sisters, brothers. They didn't believe him. They didn't believe that he actually was the Messiah. Then I'll have the parable of the sower and good soil. I'll just leave it at that. Sower and good soil. And then he calms the storm and he meets the demoniac. And I just summarize that by saying demons into swine, because that's the same in all the accounts, since they named the place differently between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then after that, oh, look at that. He actually puts the question about fasting later on, way later on. Why did he do that? I don't know why. That's weird. It seems pretty clear that that question comes up during the meal with Matthew, Levi. Oh, I see. It's because it says in Matthew, while he spoke these things to them, so this is directly connected with the next event, which is the ruler which comes to ask him to heal his daughter. That healing of his daughter is later on in both Mark and Luke. So he puts that event that's tied with it, which is the question about fasting later on. That makes sense. Yeah, so I'll move the question about fasting. That's not going to be there. I'll say it's because it's tied with healing ruler's daughter. This brings me almost up to the feeding of the 5,000, and that is extremely significant because it is recorded in all four Gospels. And at that point, I am finally going to continue on with the Gospel of John, because none of this stuff is in the Gospel of John. John, the apostle, just skips over all of it, and he starts with the feeding of 5,000 and goes on into other stuff. So it should get more complicated then, because now I would have 4 to start weaving together, whereas it's been 3 for a long time. And in many of these portions, it's only 2. So that's where I'm at.